All right. Hello, everyone, and happy Pride. And welcome to our fifth annual Pride program here at Illinois Holocaust Museum. Pride and Prejudice, LGBTQ plus voices under Nazism. I am Leah Rauch. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Education here at the museum.
And my name's Matthew Sackel. I'm the Associate Manager of Education here at the museum, and I use he, him pronouns.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is our fifth annual Pride program at Illinois Holocaust Museum. And our Pride programming was started by you, Matthew. And so maybe we can start off by talking about why Illinois Holocaust Museum has a Pride program every year and what motivated you to start the program here.
Great question. So the museum is very young compared to other institutions in the city of Chicago. And the idea that we weren't already LGBTQ issues were brought up within our collection. We were able to talk about it as non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So it was always part of our curriculum here. And I realized that it deserved a core focus, and it aligned perfectly with the museum's mission to foster an understanding of communities that faced persecution. And it was greenlit, and so we've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your leadership and for starting this.
It's my pleasure.
It's also an honor for me to be joining with you. So yeah, I mean, it's just really important to be sharing these stories in general, specifically LGBTQ plus voices under Nazism, because those voices were silenced and they were erased by the Nazi regime, and also in the years following the Second World War. We know in the US, for example, the situation for LGBTQ plus people, it was not safe to be out or to be open. And so a lot of those stories were not told. And it's due to the work of some incredible scholars who are, to this day in archives and trying to
unearthing new stories, new narratives, and looking at language that was used that may have been language that today we wouldn't necessarily think of as LGBTQ, but that's how it was written into the archives, into the paperwork then.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And just in general, talking about LGBTQ plus history, right? To acknowledge that LGBTQ plus people were there. We've always been there. And talking about it and acknowledging it is not only affirming for LGBTQ plus people, but it also helps to combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference today. And of course, attacks on LGBTQ plus people were not new to the Nazi regime. It predates it way before the Nazis came along. And unfortunately, as we know, it is something that is still continuing today. So it didn't end with the Nazis either. And so just like when we talk about Holocaust related issues, we always integrate anti-Semitism, which is an important part of the Holocaust, talking about homophobia, transphobia, and attacks on LGBTQ plus people, LGBTQ plus rights as well, is something that is integral to that conversation.
And people always ask, so where are all the stories? Like, why haven't we heard these narratives before? Where are the stories? There just aren't stories that are recorded. Out of the 55,000 testimonies given by in the Spielberg Foundation, USC Shoah testimonies, only 6 of the testimonies are flagged as LGBTQ narratives. Doesn't mean they're the only ones. They're the only ones that have been called out. The narratives of the other people may have included that, but it wasn't the primary narrative of their story, of their persecution.
If I could jump in, that was due to a few reasons. One of which was that it was illegal, right,
Correct.
to be gay. So to talk about that story,
you're
really
breaking the law.
So understandably, those stories were not told or recorded for the safety of that individual. Yeah.
And then why we have so few now. It's interesting to note that, and this is facts and figures for men, but approximately 100,000 gay men before the war came, and Leah will go into this very soon, were prosecuted under existing German law. approximately 50,000 of those people who were arrested under this were sentenced to prison. And out of those 50,000, around 10 to 15,000 of them, so a considerable portion, were then sent on to concentration camps. And the survival rate of LGBTQ in concentration camps is almost immeasurable. It's so small, and they were subjected to barbaric treatment within the camp. Like, people didn't, just because they were both inmates in the camp didn't mean that people who were their fellow inmates didn't have preconceived notions and prejudices of their own. And so they were often abused, beat up, murdered. If they weren't murdered by the Nazis, they were murdered by other inmates.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the law that existed in Nazi Germany was known as Paragraph 175. And Paragraph 175 was part of the German Criminal Code, which fell under crimes and offenses against morality. And this was something that was written into the law in 1871 when Germany unified, but it was actually taken from language from the Prussian legal code all the way back in the 1700s. So again, this was something that existed way before the Nazis came along. It was there through Imperial Germany, through the Weimar Republic era, through Nazi Germany, and again, as I mentioned, all the way in the post-war era, all the way till 1994.
1994.
Taken off the books, yeah, which is incredible. But Paragraph 175 specified that it was illegal for unnatural and indecent acts, and I'm quoting from this, among men specifically. But this was something that wasn't really prosecuted so much, especially not in the Weimar Republic time period. And when the Nazis came to power, they, within 2 years of them being in power, they decided to rewrite or revise
and enhance
this law. So they changed it to say that this wasn't just physical acts between men, this was also anything that could be construed as sexual, which included anything in the form of word or gesture.
The glance.
Right. So literally the way that you could look at someone, they could denounce you to the Gestapo, or yeah, something that might have been overheard. And we do have records, police records of people who were arrested under Paragraph 175 for walking a certain way. So they would be denounced and then arrested. So this revision also greatly increased the amount of punishments that would be given as well. Interestingly, when Paragraph 175 was revised, there were discussions about including women in the law, and they decided against it for a few reasons. One of which was that women were not part of public life in a way that men were. They did not hold political positions, and they just did not have a lot of power, so they were not seen as a threat.
Positions of sway, like political jobs or college professors, etc.
Exactly. And women were also seen as very passive, non-sexual creatures, and were considered to be people that could be persuaded to be straight.
And have babies.
Exactly. And you know, they could technically be forced. They could be raped, right, and forced to have children, which would then fulfill the mother role, which was first and foremost the most important part of a woman's role in society, according to Nazi ideology. I should specify, for people that were considered to be Aryan women. So women were not included under Paragraph 175. But there were certainly cases where women were punished specifically because of their sexual orientation. And that takes us to the first story that we are going to be sharing today, a woman named Casa Albus. And unfortunately, with all of the stories that I'm sharing, there are no photographs that exist.
I have them.
Matthew has them all. But it's important to also point that out, that, right, the Nazis really tried to erase the stories and the history and the culture of LGBTQ people as well. And so sadly, there might be some that exist that we just historians have not found. But Casa Albus was born in Duisburg, Germany in 1892. She was someone who was in a relatively privileged position. She was considered to be Aryan, and she was also a member of the Nazi Party.
Which I'm going to break in here. So we're talking about persecution under Nazism. Nobody was free from this. Everybody had to follow these rules. Being gay was illegal no matter who you were.
Right. Yeah. And she actually was able to own and operate her own psychiatric hospital. She opened that in 1934. So the Nazis came to power in 1933. So about a year into their reign, she opened this hospital. She was 42 years old in a small town called Joachimsthal, which is just outside the city of Berlin. I couldn't find a photo from that time period, but this is a photo of the town today. It's around 3,000 people, and it hasn't really grown at all, maybe a couple hundred people in those intervening years. So she ran this hospital. About 6 years into running the hospital, she met a woman named Marta Godemann. And Marta Godemann's father was a patient in the hospital, and they ended up starting a relationship. Casa Albus would go to Berlin to visit her. She would
Very
stay
soap
with her.
opera.
She eventually, the following year, hired Godemann as a nurse to work at the hospital, despite the fact that she was only trained, not only, but she was trained to be a tailor. So having no training or experience as a nurse, she was hired to be one to move in and work at the hospital. So they lived together, they shared the same room. Apparently there was a falling out, and this was, we don't know exactly what happened. This is all based on police reports, but this was possibly due to another woman entering the picture, a woman by the name of Erika Schwabe. And after Casa Albus and Marta Godemann broke up, Erika Schwabe started working at the hospital about a month later. And sadly, a few months after that, she actually died by suicide in the hospital. And in the resulting aftermath of that, Godemann ended up denouncing Casa Albus to the Gestapo, which opened an investigation. And in this investigation, she was accused of, and I'm quoting here, having sustained same-sex intercourse with women up to the present day. The people of the town also participated in this investigation, claiming that she was bringing in young women who were not qualified and having relationships with them. And she was also blamed for the suicide of Erika Schwabe. Albus denied it all. She said, actually, it was Godemann who was trying to seduce her. She said she was a victim of small town gossip and none of it was true. But the court ended up ruling, and I'll read from the court ruling, the accused, Casa Albus, has herewith forfeited the right through proven abnormal sexual disposition and activities to continue to remain in the party. The NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, fights every sexual degeneration, whether or not it is criminally actionable. Female same-sex activity represents a significant threat to marriage and the natural disposition of the woman to motherhood. So she was stripped of her party membership. She lost her license to operate the hospital. That's really all that happened to her that we know of, which, not to make light of that.
Right, that's a lot.
Right. But she, after this all happened, she maintained that she remains a National Socialist no matter what. So she stayed a Nazi herself, even though she was stripped of her party membership. But we see here, specifically in the court ruling, that obviously she was being punished because she was a lesbian or because she had relationships with other women, even though it did not fall into the criminal code of paragraph 175. But this just highlights the variety and diversity of the LGBTQ community. As you mentioned before, we have someone who was a member of the Nazi Party who had a vastly different experience than the other people that we're going to be talking about today. But persecution took many different forms, from harassment to, having being socially ostracized, to, people, of course, being sent to camps and being murdered in the camp system. But it would be a disservice if we did not acknowledge the diversity of these experiences, or if we only focused on the most tragic of stories. So yeah, that is Casa Albus. But Matthew, you have the story of someone who was actually arrested under paragraph 175.
Correct. So the person I'm going to talk about is Rudolph Rossdale. He was born in 1913 in Leipzig, Germany, and he became a bellhop at a hotel in downtown Leipzig in 1937. And through a series of events and association with other gay people, he was arrested under paragraph 175, just because he hung out with other gay people. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. His sentence was served, and he was moved to another part of the Reich. Again, in April of 1941, he was arrested again. And in June of 1942, having served his second sentence in prison, he was being put into protective custody and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he remained until his liberation in 1945. After he, well, actually, Leah, you can actually let Rudolph tell you about what happened to him in his own words.
In April 1937, Rudolph is jailed for 6 months under paragraph 175. Rudolph was again convicted in 1941 and after prison was deported to the concentration camp of Buchenwald, where he arrived on August 8, 1942.
Ich hatte meine Gefängnisstrafe hinter mir und dann wurde ich anschließend ins Konzentrationslager eingeliefert. Ich habe nie gewusst, wo es hingeht, aber was soll ich machen? In der Hitlerzeit bist du machtlos gewesen. Ich bin dann eingeliefert worden und dann kam ich zum Beispiel in einen großen Raum, da war ein Schwimmbecken. In den Schwimmbecken mussten wir uns nackt ausziehen und mussten da Bad nehmen. Das war wegen der Desinfektion. Da war ein SS, der hatte mich mit dem Kopf in die Lauge hineingedrückt. Mir ist so kotzig geworden. Und dann hat er mir noch mein goldenes Kettchen mit dem Kreuz drauf, wo mir mein Freund gekauft hatte, hat er mir weggerissen und hat zu mir gesagt, ob ich ein Pfaffenkittel bin. Ich habe natürlich nicht geantwortet. Und so habe ich die Desinfektion hinter mir gebracht und bin dann wieder angezogen worden. Natürlich andere Kleider, gestreifte, haben wir auch unser Zeichen bekommen. Das war ein dreieckiger Winkel. Auf der linken Brustseite wurde er angesteckt und das war das Zeichen von der Homosexualität. Es war noch so lächerlich rosa. Die anderen, die vorbestraften Häftlinge, hatten einen grünen Winkel und dann waren noch Asoziale, die hatten den schwarzen Winkel.
So after he was released, rather than move back to Germany, he and a French prisoner moved to France. And then at a costume ball in the early 1950s, Rudolph met Eddie. And they would become life partners. And Eddie died in 2003. Rossdale died on the 3rd of August in 2011 at the age of 98. He was the last known concentration camp survivor deported by Nazis on charges of homosexuality and persecuted under paragraph 175.
Yeah, so he unbelievably survived Buchenwald concentration camp. And that was, like you said, incredibly rare for someone who had the pink triangle to survive in the camp system, because they were some of the absolute worst that were treated in the camps.
And then to go on and speak about it.
Right.
That's the important part. We're very fortunate to have his interview. This is only a brief portion of it, but he goes on to detail other parts of his stay in the camp.
Yeah. So yeah, others were arrested and sent to camps for different reasons, although their sexual orientation certainly played a role in their arrest. And that takes us to our next story with Ellie Smula. So Ellie was born in 1914 in Charlottenburg, Berlin. She came from a family, her mother was a housemaid. Her father had actually died in serving in World War I, but they weren't married. So her mother did not get the widow's pension that she would have gotten. And so they struggled financially. And the money that they did have presumably went to Ellie's older brother, Willie, who was trained to be a carpenter. So Ellie was an unskilled worker.
But it's also real important to point out at this point that her father was in the army, that he was a soldier.
Right.
And he served for Germany.
Right. And these were, this was a family of individuals who were considered to be Aryan as well. Right. So we don't know a lot about Ellie's personal life. We don't have the documentation. We don't have any letters or diaries or anything to really inform us much about who she was. We do know that she was not married, and she was not a member of the Nazi Party or any Nazi-affiliated organizations like the League of German Girls or any of that. She was not a member. When she was 25 years old in 1940, she was sent to work for the BVG, which is the Berlin Transit Company that still exists today. And this was considered, public transit was considered to be very important to the war effort because it transported people to their jobs, to work in armaments factories, for example, and to help support the economy. But with the war, of course, the male employees were all taken to fight in the war, and so there was a severe personnel shortage. And so therefore, they hired over 3,000 women to work for the public transit system, including Ellie Smula. So she was assigned to work as a conductor of the tram station Elsenstrasse, which is today right next to Treptower Park, if anyone is familiar with Berlin. And this was an important station. It was the starting point and the end point for many different tram lines throughout the city. And the photo that you see is from this time period of a tram in Alexanderplatz. It's not exactly where she worked, but still same time period, so you can see the tram. So she started working there in July of 1940. On that exact same day, another woman named Margarete Rosenberg started working there as well. And like I said, we don't know a lot about what happened exactly, but we know that within a couple of months, they were both arrested by the Gestapo at their place of work and taken to the prison at Alexanderplatz. From there, they were taken to the Gestapo headquarters, which was also the Reichssecurity main office. And today, this is known as the Topography of Terror. And the photo that you see on the left there is one of the cells there in the prison. It was called the house prison, where people would be taken and interrogated. They usually didn't stay there. They were brought in and then taken back to whatever other prison that they were staying in. So that photo was taken right after the war. The building was severely damaged. They ended up tearing it down. And to the right is what remains of it today. But this was a place that was really known for being extremely brutal. It was very much feared. It was the Gestapo headquarters, right? And they would bring people in and interrogate them to try to get information. So both Ellie Smula and Margareta Rosenberg were brought in at least 4 times over the course of a few weeks. And as a result of the investigation, the interrogation, we have a note by the Gestapo, which reads, the BVG received complaints that some female conductors who worked in the tram station Treptow maintained regular intercourse with fellow women workers of their station. Lesbian intercourse, that is. For instance, it was asserted that they took fellow workers with them back to their place, plied them with alcohol, and then performed homosexual intercourse with them. The next day, the women were consequently not able to carry out their duties. As a result, the operation of the tram station Treptow was severely compromised. So rather than trying to, prosecute them under paragraph 75, which obviously didn't include women, instead they found another reason.
Another venue to persecute them.
Absolutely. So we do know that Margareta Rosenberg confessed in the interrogations under police custody. We don't know what Ellie Smula said or if she confessed. We unfortunately don't have that documentation. But they were both then deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the concentration camp primarily for women, just to the north of Berlin, on November 30th in 1940. And the paperwork for when they arrived stated that their reason for arrest was subversive conduct. And they claimed that they were hurting the state, they were hurting the war efforts by having this negative effect on the way the tram station operated and the public transportation system in general. So they were classified as political prisoners. They were given the red triangle in the camp system. But on that arrival list, it was also noted that they were both lesbians. So that was added in as well, next to their grounds for detention for political reasons.
And also, I just want to point out that being listed as a lesbian was listed in a code, in a list of violations or reasons that they were arrested. So again, they're being persecuted while not on paper for that reason. It was pointed out as well as they screw off at work, like they're affecting the German transportation system, bad thing, oh, and they're lesbians. Like that was viewed as criminal conduct.
Right, and it was considered noteworthy enough to actually put that into
Correct.
their information in their files when they arrived at the camp. So in July of 1943, Ellie's mother, Marta Smula, received a notice from the Ravensbrück camp administration that her daughter very suddenly died. That was all the information that she was given. So Ellie was 28 years old at the time. Margareta Rosenberg actually ended up surviving. So here we have a situation, again, where they obviously were arrested and murdered. Ellie was murdered because of the fact that she was lesbian, or maybe I shouldn't say the fact, the accusations. Again, we don't know. This is all based on police reports. Right. But yeah, finding other reasons. And this also highlights how difficult it is for historians to go in and track down the stories of these individuals.
And to unravel them. Yeah.
Right. So they can't go in and look for a specific triangle across the board, because that only tells a very small fraction of the stories of individuals who were who suffered under Nazism. But of course, there were other LGBTQ people who suffered for reasons that, or they were arrested for reasons unrelated to their sexual orientation.
Correct. And an example of that will be a man named Manfred Lewin. And here, just as in the previous slide, you can see Manfred is on the right, and his stumbling block, Stupstein, is there detailing his life. He was Jewish, but he was not arrested for being Jewish. This is the story of his boyfriend, Gad Beck. Gad Beck was born in 1923 in Berlin, Germany. You can see his photographs there on the left. His mixed parentage, his father was Catholic, but his mother was Jewish. prevented him from being deported with other German Jews who were rounded up because they were, that was that particular list of people to round up that day. In 1942, his boyfriend was sent to a pre-deportation camp, which was down the street. When Gad found out, he went to Manfred's employer and said, Manfred is being deported. Can you help me? And very altruistically said, well, my son has a Hitler Youth uniform. You want to put that on and see if you can sneak in and get him? But I'll actually let Gad tell you this story.
Das ist die berühmte jüdische Familie meines Vaters in Wien.
Wer hat überlebt?
Welcher davon? Welcher davon? Der hat überlebt und der.
Ja.
Alles andere ist umgekommen. Auschwitz. Zu dieser Zeit traf ich meine erste große Liebe, Manfred. Und es wurde eine fast dramatische Liebe. Ja, und dann war es aber eines Tages soweit. Ich kam am Abend in das Haus, ich wollte übernachten dort. Und da war sein Bruder. Wo ist Manfred? Na, unsere ganze Familie haben sie heute abgeholt. Und ich ging wirklich zu dem Chef von Manfred und sage ihm, hören Sie, Sie haben den Manfred abgeholt. Mit der ganzen Familie. Die sind in der großen Hamburger Straße, in meinem Schulgebäude. Na, hast du denn Mut? Sagt er, so richtig deutscher Werber. Ja, ich hab Mut. Hör mal, sagt er, mein Sohn ist doch so groß wie du. Der hat eine Hitlerjugenduniform. Gehst du drin, holst du mir raus den Manfred? Ich ging in die große Hamburger, ging da rein. Herr Littler, ich möchte den Obersturmannführer sprechen. Und der sagt mir ganz ruhig, diese Gestapo-Fritze dort, na, Sie bringen mir doch den zurück. Ich sage, was soll ich denn mit den Juden? Und geh mit ihm raus. Aus meiner Schule. 20, 30 Meter etwa. Ich weiß genau, welche Stelle es ist. Gebe ihm 20 Mark, die nimmt er auch und sage ihm, du fährst jetzt zum Onkel Bobby. Du weißt doch, ich telefoniere mit ihm und dann treffen wir uns dort, ich komme dorthin. Und er bleibt stehen und sagt ganz ruhig, aber also ohne jede Erregung, ich kann mit dir nicht kommen, Gott. Wenn ich jetzt meine Familie verlasse, die kranke Familie, bin ich in meinem Leben nie frei mehr. Ich habe mit ihnen zu gehen. Ich bin der einzige Starke und Kräftige. Sagt nicht auf Wiedersehen, dreht sich um und geht zurück in meine Schule. Ich ging entgegengesetzt von ihm fort. Ohne dass ich denken konnte, hatte ich den Eindruck, hier ist etwas für ewig zerbrochen worden.
Gad went on to join an underground effort to supply food and hiding places to Jews escaping to neutral Switzerland. In early 1945, a Jewish spy for the Gestapo betrayed him and some of his underground friends. He was subsequently interrogated and interned in a Jewish transit camp. His parents and sister did survive the war, thanks to help from their Christian relatives on his mother's side. After World War II, Beck helped organize efforts to enable Jewish survivors to emigrate to Israel, emigrating himself in 1947. He died in 2012, leaving behind a partner of 35 years in Berlin, Germany. And you too can learn more about him by reading An Underground Life, Memoirs of a Gay Jew in Nazi Berlin. It's available for sale on Amazon, and your local library should have it. If they don't, tell them to get it. But you can see here that, again, in this particular situation, he wasn't sought out or arrested under these laws, but people he loved and people he cared about were affected by these laws. And that brings us to the next person to talk about another identity that was persecuted under this.
Right, right. Well, I also just want to say, I've seen this clip a few times, and it's just so heart-wrenching to think of, of that happening with Manfred. But also, what strikes me too is just the bravery, like for him to go in there, to put on a Nazi youth uniform
and salute Hitler.
Right. It's astounding. And then all of the work that he did after that as well. It's just an incredible story of Gad and his life. But yeah, one of his parents was Jewish.
Correct.
And Manfred was also Jewish. And usually to have that combination of being Jewish and being gay was an extremely deadly combination. Yeah, it's again remarkable that he survived and shared that story with all of us for future generations as well. But yeah, that leads us to the next point of this idea of intersectionality, of having more than one identity. The Nazis love to just use these triangles and to categorize people into certain ways and certain categories. And of course, people are much more complicated than that. And there are quite a few stories of people whose these combination of identities contributed to their arrest and ultimately their fate. And so that takes us to a woman by the name of Waltraud Hock. She wrote a short biography, handwritten, while she was in police custody. And this was written in 1941. And in this report, she basically explains why she was in police custody. So I'll use her account of what happened in her life. So she was born October 8th of 1922. And when she was 19 years old in 1941, she went to the employment office in Wiesbaden, which is near Frankfurt, and which is pictured there as well. But she went to the employment office to inquire about working as a conductor for the public transportation system in Wiesbaden, similar to Ellie Smula's job. Instead, though, she was not given that job. Instead, she was assigned to work on a farm as part of the war effort. And she didn't want to work on the farm. So she showed up, she did as she was told, she went to work, and she told the farmer, and I'm quoting from her, she told the farmer that agricultural work would not be enjoyable for me. And according to her, the farmer replied, then it's not useful for you to come because one should love the work they do. So she went home and she took that response from the farmer as basically giving her permission to not come back. So she didn't think she had to keep going to work there. So she went home, she waited to be reassigned by the employment office. Instead, they sent her a couple of letters, which she just ignored, hoping that they would get the hint and that they would assign her something else as she originally requested. But instead, they actually came and arrested her. She was considered to be work shy, which was a category that people were arrested under, not being willing to work, not willing to contribute to the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community. And so she was arrested. She was sentenced to 3 months in prison for not showing up to work. And that's when she wrote this account of what happened. And in this account, she said that once her prison sentence was complete, then, and I'm quoting, I will immediately get to work. However, once she was in the system, there was other information that came to light, which caught the attention of the authorities. For example, she had to repeat the 2nd grade. And when they found this out, they sent her report to youth services to assess her case. And they came back and claimed that her academic problems were due to laziness and indifference, which is, again, reinforcing this idea that she was work shy, that she didn't want to work, that she was lazy, she didn't want to do her schoolwork either. It also came to light that her biological father was a Black American occupation soldier. So US troops were stationed in Germany following World War I from 1918 to 1923. He stayed in Germany, and this meant that Waltraud was not considered to be racially pure in the eyes of the Nazi regime. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, her father was taken into protective custody, and sadly he died by suicide while he was in custody. Their investigation also revealed that her mother had been forcibly sterilized. It didn't say exactly why, but it's not such a big jump to conclude that the fact that she had been in a relationship with a Black American soldier, and she had been in other relationships as well, contributed to this, specifically because of the July 1933 law, or the sterilization law, as it was known, it had a much longer name, but that would have stipulated that she should be forcibly sterilized.
And not have any more children because she was polluting the race pool, essentially.
Right. So Waltraud, they also discovered that she had been married at the age of 16 and had a child, which she was accused of not caring for. That marriage ended in 1941. It also came to light that she had previously stolen 20 Reichsmark, which is nothing, but it was in her file, it was on the record, that caught their attention as well. She was also accused, along with her mother, and I'm quoting here, of entertaining lovers in their apartment, but were not to be caught because they were so sneaky. And also in the reports, they reported that Waltraud was also a lesbian.
Again, I just want to point out that's being pointed out in a list of violations to German law. So again, this is, while not a written law under paragraph 175, it's still something that they point out as a criminal in context with other criminal acts.
Right. So as a result of this report, they concluded that the cause of her crime of not showing up to work was moral rot. Also in this conclusion of the report, they asked a couple of questions of the person who was filling it out. The first was, do you believe benevolence or sternness will be effective? And they answered sternness. And the second question was, where should the person be brought after their release? And the answer that was entered was workhouse or camp. So after 3 months of her prison sentence, when she should have been released, instead, she was sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, and was classified there as being asocial. So she was given a black triangle.
Which was mentioned actually in the first video clip we played with Brazda, and he talks about the company he was keeping at the camp and the stars that were being given to them.
Right. So this black triangle, or this asocial category, was one that was given to many different people for many different reasons of arrest. And essentially, this was a category for people who did not belong, or on the margins of society, who were not part of the national community or the Volksgemeinschaft. And interestingly, by late 1938, people who were categorized as being asocial were up to 70% of all camp prisoners in the camp system, up until Kristallnacht, essentially, of the November pogrom, and all of that changed. We have here the intake records. You see listed or shown on the screen this photograph here. She is there under number 39, and then we see the date of her birth, followed by ASOZ, so the abbreviation for asocial, exactly. We don't know when, but at some point she was transferred to Auschwitz, and she ended up being killed there in March of 1943. So here we have an individual who believed she didn't have to go to work and didn't go to work, and was originally arrested for that, sentenced to a few months of prison, and ended up a couple years later dead in Auschwitz, which is really astounding, right? And as we saw in all of these lists of things that this investigation and this police report revealed, that her sexuality, her sexual orientation, the fact or the accusation of being a lesbian, certainly played a part in what ultimately happened to her, but so did so many other things as well. And this really illustrates that persecution of individuals was not based on a single identity or a single act, but rather the intersectionality of all of those coming into play here.
Correct. Dr. Danny Cohen has an interesting term for that, overlapping triangles, which is actually pretty perfect for camp uniforms. The triangles represented their identities to the Nazis and to other prisoners and people looking in. But identities are so much deeper than that. But it is interesting to see that the aspects of these people that we focus on now are not the same that we're focused on then.
Right, right. And again, this illustrates the difficulty that historians have piecing these stories together. I know I already said this, but some historians would single out, aspects of her identity and weigh them against others, right? And making assumptions on which had a greater influence on her death. But I should point out that all of this information that I got on Waltraud, also Casa Albus, was from Samuel Huneka, who is a scholar who is currently working on a book specifically about lesbians in the Holocaust.
Which there isn't a great deal about.
There is not. Yeah.
There is a dearth of information. It's interesting to see the huge issues that Waltraud had as compared to other people, though. She was incarcerated. She had a laundry list of things that were quote unquote wrong with her. But not everybody who was LGBTQ during the Holocaust was a victim. Some people were helpers. And so that actually brings me to the next person, Freda Bellenfant. She was born in 1904 in Amsterdam. By 1939, Freda was a renowned musician and cellist. And there you can see on the right a portrait of her. The Nazi occupation of Amsterdam in 1940 really put a damper on her music career and her personal life. And through a series of friendships and associations, she became actively involved with the Dutch underground resistance. They were known as the CKC, and they were known for having organized and executed the bombing of the population registry in Amsterdam on March 27th of 43, which destroyed thousands of files and hindered the Nazi attempts to compare forged documents with real ones. She basically put a huge road bump in front of them. When the KCK group came under scrutiny by the Gestapo after the bombing, it forced Bellenfante and other members into hiding. And while she was in hiding, Bellenfant learned of the arrests and executions of other KCK members. She disguised herself with a man and lived with her friends for 3 months. But I want her to tell you a little bit about that adventure.
I have a haircut.
I still remember the day I went there. And I really looked pretty good in my disguise. And Barbara walks up to me and he said, "What do you want, sir? Shave or haircut?" And I said, "No, just haircut." And he didn't. Bat an eye. For 3 months I was disguised as a man, and very successfully so. And I passed my mother several times during that time, and she never recognized me.
So while living in the open as a man, the resistance helped her avoid capture and cross the border into Belgium and France, where the French underground helped her to make her way to Switzerland. When she and her travel partner arrived at the border in the winter of 1944, they were forced to cross the Alps on foot to reach safety. Her former teacher, Herman Scherchen, saved her from being sent back over the border by verifying that she was a Dutch citizen and his former pupil. On arriving in Montreux, she was given refugee status and worked for a short time as a farm laborer, which she didn't complain about. Bellenfant was repatriated to the Netherlands as soon as the war ended. She emigrated to America in 1947, where she resumed her successful career as a conductor and cellist. Her official papers are kept at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum now in Washington, D.C. She died in 1995 in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
All right. Yeah, this is an incredible story. Again, similar to Gad Beck of taking a stand, of being an upstander.
Correct.
And taking those risks. And I cannot believe that her mother did not.
Her own mom.
Recognize her. It's pretty impressive. Yeah, so we are now going to open it up to some questions. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A and we would love to answer them. So I see we do have one question from Peter asking if this is going to be recorded. Yes, this is being recorded as we speak, and it will be up on the museum's YouTube page in the following days.
Yep.
Yeah.
Some people have wondered about including, going back to the beginning, why we started all of this, why we included a Pride celebration or commemoration in all of our annual programming. And some people might even wonder, well, you just had the Rise Up exhibition, which was amazing and told the story of gay pride and gay rights in America. Didn't you have enough of that? That's not what this is about. This is about pointing out rights and wrongs in history. And this particular chapter in history was particularly brutal. People were really asking a lot of themselves when they were taking part in all of this. We're asking about what sources did we use to prepare for this presentation. I used a lot of Shoah testimonies, memoirs, and scholarly articles. And also, I should point out that Geoffrey Giles, a professor in Florida, has done a lot of work on the LGBTQ community under the Nazi rule, and his work is fascinating.
Yeah, I relied heavily on the work of Samuel Vinecca, and specifically an article that was published last year called Heterogeneous Persecution, which I highly recommend. And also the work of Laurie Moorhofer, who is also someone who is focusing on stories of women and transgender people during this time period. And both of them are currently working on books. So we'll be bringing them into a public program once those are published. So we're excited. Again, this is a field that is very exciting, I find, because it is one that we hadn't previously known much about, and we still don't know a lot about. And so there is a lot of really cutting edge research happening in archives by these scholars. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Ellen asks a question about were gay men who were imprisoned or placed in concentration camps or were still subject to paragraph after World War II. Yes. Paragraph 175 wasn't formally dissolved until 1994. And so oftentimes after men got out of the concentration camps, oftentimes they were then put right into the general population at prisons. And astonishingly, in some German prisons, the crime you were incarcerated for was actually on your cell door, so that the guards knew what you had been put in jail for. So everybody knew when you went to jail after you got out and served your sentence, even when they got out of jail, having finished serving their sentences, they had criminal records. Many of these were not expunged until even much later than that. And it was Angela Merkel and her government that finally paid money to gay survivors if they were willing to admit to being gay after their experiences when they were filling out paperwork. And it was something minor. It was like $500, $1,000 or something like that for all the pain and suffering that they had incurred. But they also had to have been in a concentration camp and then sent to prison, and then they could apply. And by then, these people were in their 80s, 90s, and probably didn't even want to deal with that sort of stuff.
But it was a very symbolic gesture and very important.
Correct.
Right.
It was a new era in German government.
So Sylvia asks, were those who were picked up by the SS just arrested randomly, or were they denounced for the most part? Which is a great question, because I was going to mention that earlier and I forgot. But back when I showed the Stolperstein for Ellie Smula, it had in the word denunziert, very large and prominent on that memorial for her, which means denounced, right? And so the whole reason that she was arrested, and also Casa Albus, and you know, many of these stories and many of these individuals, was because they were denounced, because they were reported to the Gestapo and to the authorities. And this is a very, very large part of the stories that are told about LGBTQ people, because it had a huge, huge influence. And it's important to point out the active participation
of the general
German
population, right,
who were reporting.
And anecdotally, it was reported by a police department that police basically told the population of their city, like, stop telling us your neighbors are gay. Like, we don't have enough staff to deal with all of these denunciations. It was a horrible thing to tell on someone and say that they were gay, because it definitely meant persecution.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, it's very much an important part to talk about, the denunciations that occurred. So there is a comment about laws today continuing to persecute gay and trans youth especially. And yeah, I mean, that is something that we absolutely need to talk about. It's not something that is completely disconnected from this topic, especially when we have situations where people are being forbidden from talking about LGBTQ history in the classroom. So this is incredibly important to talk about, and we will continue to talk about that at the museum and in our educational program.
And I will point out that Illinois is one of a handful of states that actually mandates LGBTQ history in their classrooms, starting in 3rd grade, moving forward into high school. And I think that's pretty phenomenal that Leah and I are fortunate to work in a state where we can do these trainings, which in fact, I did the first training in Illinois on that subject, how to teach LGBTQ history.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes, I'm an upstander.
Okay, so let's see.
Megan asked a question if there are other stories that didn't fit into our presentation. There aren't a lot of stories, but there are some other really great stories. There's one I could recommend, Pierre Seal. He wrote a book called I, Pierre Seal, and it's about his experience. He actually, after he got out of prison, was sent to a concentration camp. When he got out, he actually got married and had kids, and realized what secret he was hiding. And then when the new French government was coming in, he finally felt that he needed to spoke up and add a voice to the LGBTQ community. Another really important book was written called Men with the Pink Triangle by a man named Joseph Cahoot, who was known as Heinz Heger. And he was actually the first person to publish an LGBTQ memoir of the Holocaust. And so those are important. And there was a docu-film done a few years ago called Dear Freddy, F-R-E-D-Y, and I highly recommend you watch it. It's a fascinating story about a young fitness professional from Berlin who didn't escape with his parents, decided his parents moved to Uruguay. He decided that he was going to go nowhere, because a good Jewish boy would only move to Palestine if he was going to go anywhere. And so to be safe, he moved to Prague, where he was promptly interred in Terezin and then taken to Auschwitz, where he ran a children's camp. And it's fascinating. And there are many stories about Freddy Hirsch. In fact, there's another book called The Librarian of Auschwitz. And the librarian of Auschwitz was one of the children that Freddy took care of while he was in Auschwitz. So there are dozens of stories that could be shared and can be shared, but you have to tune in next year.
Yeah, so while it seems like there's not a lot, and really there isn't that much out there, there is. So, you know.
Compared, I mean, like if we walk into the Brill Family Resource Center right now and look up Lithuanian memoirs of the Holocaust, there are hundreds, or French memoirs of the Holocaust, there are hundreds. But literally speaking, I could carry all of the memoirs in my hands, and I'm not strong. So like I could carry all of them in my hands that have been written. It's really, there's a huge dearth of this subject.
Right. And hopefully next year at this time, we'll have many more resources and more works that have been published on this topic to share with you. But unfortunately, we are out of time. We didn't get to all of the questions. There was actually quite a few that came in, so thank you. But you can send us an email, and we'd be happy to continue this conversation. There should be a survey that was posted in the Q&A, or sorry, in the chat. And so if you could fill that out, that would be fantastic. It will also be emailed to everyone who registered for the program. So it can take a few minutes to fill that out. We would appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much
for joining us.
Happy Pride
Happy
2022. Pride. And thank you for joining us.
All right. We'll see you next year.
Bye-bye.